What if I told you that the most powerful empire in human history was brought to its knees in just 11 days? Not by bombs, not by armies, but by a single phone call. And what if I told you that America is walking down the exact same path right now, making the identical mistakes that destroyed Britain's global dominance forever? November 1956. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's surface. The pound sterling was the backbone of international trade. Britain had ruled the seas for over a century. Then Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain decided to show the world who was still in charge. Together with France and Israel, they launched a military invasion to retake the canal. The operation was actually succeeding. British forces were advancing. Egyptian resistance was crumbling. Victory seemed certain. But then the phone rang in London. President Eisenhower delivered an ultimatum that would echo through history. Stop your military operation immediately, or we will collapse your currency. We will dump every British pound we own onto the market. We will block your emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. We will watch your economy burn. Britain's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, faced an impossible choice. Continue the military operation and watch his nation's economy implode, or surrender to America's financial threats. Within hours, the greatest empire the world had ever seen ordered a complete withdrawal from Egypt. The Suez Crisis lasted just 11 days, but those 11 days revealed a truth that had been building for decades. Britain was no longer a superpower. It was a debtor nation living on borrowed time and borrowed money. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Britain didn't fall because of that one crisis. Britain fell because it had spent decades making the exact same financial mistakes that America is making right now, and the parallels are absolutely terrifying. Let me take you back to understand how this happened. In the 19th century, Britain was the undisputed master of the global economy. The British pound wasn't just a currency, it was the currency. When countries traded with each other, they used pounds. When central banks stored their reserves, they held pounds. When international contracts were written, they were denominated in pounds. This gave Britain almost supernatural economic power. They could print money to fund their military operations around the world. They could borrow at incredibly low interest rates because everyone trusted the pound's stability. They could run massive trade deficits year after year because the world needed their currency more than Britain needed to balance its books. Sound familiar? Because America has enjoyed this exact same privilege with the dollar for the past 80 years. But underneath Britain's apparent strength, cracks were forming. By the late 1800s, a new economic powerhouse was rising across the Atlantic. The United States had quietly surpassed Britain as the world's largest economy. American factories were outproducing British factories. American innovation was outpacing British innovation. American wealth was accumulating faster than British wealth. Yet the pound remained the world's dominant currency. Why? Because of what economists call institutional inertia. The world was accustomed to using pounds. The entire global financial infrastructure was built around the pound sterling. Switching to a new system would require massive coordination and effort. So even as Britain's economic foundation weakened, its currency remained strong through pure momentum. Then World War I changed everything. Britain borrowed staggering amounts to finance the war effort. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor nation into one of the world's largest debtor nations. They owed enormous sums to everyone, especially to the United States. Instead of accepting this new reality, instead of adjusting their spending and global ambitions to match their diminished financial position, Britain made a catastrophic decision. They chose to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, Britain committed what many economists consider one of the greatest financial blunders of the 20th century. They returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. They wanted the pound to maintain its old value, even though Britain's economy was no longer strong enough to support that value. It was pure arrogance, pure denial of economic reality. To maintain this artificially inflated pound value, Britain had to keep interest rates painfully high. This strangled domestic economic growth. Unemployment skyrocketed. British exports became prohibitively expensive for foreign buyers, crushing their manufacturing sector. Meanwhile, British political leaders continued spending as if they still commanded a global empire. They maintained military bases on every continent. They funded colonial administrations they could no longer afford. They borrowed money to sustain a lifestyle that was completely disconnected from their actual economic capacity. The warning signs were everywhere during the 1930s. During the Great Depression, currency speculators began attacking the pound because the fundamental mathematics simply didn't add up. Britain was spending far more than it earned, borrowing far more than it could realistically repay, and banking on reputation alone to keep the entire system functioning. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard entirely. The pound lost nearly 30% of its value almost overnight. But remarkably, even after this humiliation, the pound remained a major international reserve currency. How was this possible? because Britain had essentially taken its own colonies hostage to prop up its failing financial system. India, Australia, Pakistan, and dozens of other territories were forced to hold their monetary reserves in British pounds. They had no choice but to continue using Britain's currency, whether they wanted to or not. America is employing a strikingly similar strategy today through the petrodollar system. Oil is priced exclusively in dollars worldwide, which forces every nation on earth to hold American currency reserves, whether they want to or not. The crucial difference is that colonies eventually gained their independence, and oil-producing nations are increasingly tired of American foreign policy dictating their economic relationships. World War II pushed Britain even deeper into debt. By 1945, Britain owed more money than its entire economy produced in a single year. The empire was essentially bankrupt, surviving only through American loans and American goodwill. British leaders still refused to acknowledge their new reality. They maintained military deployments around the globe. They continued acting like a superpower. They kept spending money they didn't have on international prestige they could no longer afford. This brings us to November 1956, and the moment when decades of financial denial finally caught up with Britain. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain perceived it as a direct challenge to their authority and access to Middle Eastern oil resources. The military invasion was Britain's attempt to prove they were still a global power capable of projecting force anywhere in the world. But Britain had forgotten something absolutely crucial. They were no longer the world's financial center. America controlled global banking now, and America was furious about the invasion. President Eisenhower viewed the Suez operation as old-fashioned colonialism that would push newly independent nations toward the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. The United States threatened to dump all of its British pound holdings onto the international currency markets. This would have caused the pound to collapse completely, making Britain unable to import the food and energy its population needed to survive. America also blocked Britain's emergency loan application to the International Monetary Fund. Britain's foreign currency reserves were draining at over 100 million pounds per week. They were literally days away from complete economic catastrophe. Prime Minister Eden had absolutely no choice. He ordered an immediate ceasefire and total withdrawal from Egypt. In exchange, America allowed Britain to receive its IMF emergency loan. The British Empire had been brought to heel by its own creditor. 11 days was all it took to end a century of global dominance. Before moving forward, if this video made you stop and think, then the conversation doesn't end here. Leave a comment below and tell me what topic you want us to go deeper into next. This channel exists to break down what most people are never told, and your questions shape what comes next. If you want to understand these shifts before they become obvious to everyone else, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Because what's coming won't be explained on the evening news, but it will be explained here. Now let me explain why this story should absolutely terrify every American watching this video. The United States today is following the exact same playbook that destroyed Britain. Not similar patterns, not comparable situations, but identical mistakes leading to identical consequences. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II exceeded 200%. America's debt-to-GDP ratio right now is approaching 120% and climbing rapidly every single year. We added over $2 trillion to our national debt just this past year alone. We are borrowing approximately $7 billion every single day just to keep the federal government operational. Britain lost its reserve currency status, partly because it maintained a global military presence it could no longer afford to sustain. America currently spends more on military operations than the next 9 largest military budgets combined. We operate over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries worldwide. We are attempting to police the entire planet using borrowed money. Britain maintained its currency dominance by forcing colonies to use pounds. America maintains dollar dominance by forcing oil to be sold exclusively in dollars through the petrodollar system. But that arrangement is rapidly deteriorating. China and Russia now conduct the majority of their bilateral trade using their own national currencies. The BRICS nations are actively constructing alternative international payment systems. Even traditional American allies are starting to diversify their currency holdings to reduce dependence on the dollar. Britain refused to accept its diminished economic status and continued acting like the dominant global power even when the underlying numbers told a completely different story. America still behaves as if we're living in 1995, as if we manufacture everything the world needs, as if there's no viable alternative to dollar-based international trade, as if our military can solve every geopolitical problem through force or threat of force. That arrogance destroyed Britain completely. It's about to cost America everything we've built since World War II. But here's the part that genuinely keeps me awake at night. Britain's imperial collapse happened gradually over decades, then suddenly in a matter of days. For 30 years before Suez, the warning signs were absolutely everywhere. The debt accumulation, the industrial decline relative to competitors, the overextended military commitments. But because the pound remained internationally strong, because the British Empire still looked impressive on world maps, British political leaders convinced themselves that the good times would continue indefinitely. Then came one crisis, just one geopolitical miscalculation. And in 11 days, a century of global dominance was finished forever. America's Suez moment is approaching fast. It could be a failed military intervention that turns international opinion decisively against us. It could be a debt ceiling crisis where Congress plays political games one too many times, and the world concludes that American Treasury bonds are no longer the safest possible investment. It could be a geopolitical humiliation where we attempt to use economic sanctions as a weapon, and our target simply refuses to comply because they no longer need access to the American banking system. It could be something we can't even predict right now, some external shock that reveals what has been mathematically true for years. America is living far beyond its economic means, sustained only by the world's continued willingness to accept our currency and finance our deficits. The Congressional Budget Office projections for 2026 are particularly alarming. Interest payments on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually for the first time in American history. We will be spending more money servicing our debt than we spend on national defense. We will be spending more on interest payments than we spend on Medicare. We will be exactly like a household, so deep in credit card debt that the minimum monthly payments alone consume most of the family as income. When Britain reached this critical threshold, the end came with shocking speed. There was no gradual transition period. There was no gentle managed decline. One day Britain was making international demands. The next day Britain was accepting international ultimatums. One day the pound symbolized global economic power. The next day it became a cautionary tale taught in economics textbooks. The British Empire made countless strategic errors during its final decades of decline. But its ultimate fatal mistake, the decision that sealed its historical fate, was the stubborn refusal to acknowledge what was clearly visible to anyone willing to examine the data objectively. British leaders kept telling themselves that international reputation would somehow substitute for underlying economic reality, that their glorious imperial history entitled them to continued global leadership, that the world owed them deference and cooperation because of who they used to be rather than who they actually were in the present moment. America is telling itself exactly the same comforting lies right now. We believe that because we won the Cold War, because we invented the internet, because we put astronauts on the moon, the international community will continue accepting our currency and our leadership forever, regardless of our behavior or our balance sheets. We believe that being American somehow exempts us from the fundamental laws of economics and mathematics that govern every other nation in human history. Every fallen empire in world history believed precisely the same thing about their own supposed exceptionalism. The British pound didn't collapse because of foreign enemies or military defeats. It collapsed because of choices. Choices to spend more than they earned year after year. Choices to borrow money instead of building productive domestic capacity. Choices to maintain imperial pride instead of maintaining fiscal solvency. Choices to live in nostalgic fantasies about past glory instead of preparing realistically for future challenges. America is making those exact same choices right now, every single day. Through every budget we pass and every priority we establish, the clock is ticking toward our own reckoning. I'm not sharing this historical parallel to make you feel hopeless or defeated. I'm sharing it because history provides our best possible teacher, but only if we're willing to learn from other people as catastrophic mistakes instead of repeating them ourselves. Britain ignored every single warning sign until ignoring them was no longer possible. We still have a narrow window of opportunity to choose a different path forward, but that window is closing rapidly with each passing month. There's one more parallel I need to share with you, and this one might be the most chilling comparison of all. Before Suez, before the final humiliation, there was actually a brief moment when Britain could have changed course completely. In the early 1950s, a handful of economists and Treasury Department officials clearly saw what was coming. They wrote detailed internal government memos warning that Britain's fiscal position was mathematically unsustainable. They begged political leaders to cut military spending dramatically, to stop pretending they could afford global empire, to accept the new reality of a post-imperial world before external forces imposed that reality upon them. Those warnings were completely ignored. Politicians didn't want to hear pessimistic news that might hurt their electoral prospects. The general public didn't want to accept national decline or reduced international status. Newspapers dismissed the economic pessimists as traitors and defeatists who lacked proper patriotic spirit. Everyone desperately wanted to believe that Britain was still great, still powerful, still destined for continued global leadership. So the reckless spending continued, the dangerous borrowing continued, the collective denial continued right up until November 1956, when economic reality could no longer be postponed or ignored. America is standing at that exact same historical crossroads right now. The warnings are everywhere if you're willing to look for them. The Congressional Budget Office has been sounding alarms about unsustainable debt trajectories for years. Economists across the entire political spectrum agree that our current fiscal path represents a mathematical impossibility. Former Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve chairmen, and even Wall Street executives are publicly warning that fundamental changes must come soon. And just like in 1950s Britain, those warnings are being systematically ignored. Politicians continue promising tax cuts combined with increased spending programs. The voting public continues expecting government services without wanting to pay the taxes necessary to fund them. Anyone who points out the basic arithmetic gets dismissed as a pessimist or an alarmist or a partisan trying to score political points. We even have our own version of Britain's obsession with maintaining the gold standard at an artificial exchange rate. Britain destroyed its domestic economy trying to maintain a currency value that no longer reflected their actual economic strength. America is destroying our long-term fiscal stability trying to maintain a standard of living that no longer reflects our actual productive capacity relative to our consumption patterns. We consume far more than we produce domestically. We spend significantly more than we earn as a nation. We borrow from future generations to pay for present-day consumption. And we tell ourselves this arrangement can continue indefinitely because we're America and somehow different from every other country in world history. Let me be absolutely clear about what happens when a reserve currency loses its privileged international status. This isn't some abstract economic concept that only affects financial markets. It's devastation for ordinary working families. When the pound collapsed, British citizens watched their savings lose purchasing power almost overnight. The cost of imported goods skyrocketed because Britain had to pay for foreign products with a weakened currency. Inflation eroded wages and living standards. Jobs disappeared as industries dependent on cheap foreign inputs could no longer compete internationally. The comfortable middle-class British lifestyle that people had taken for granted simply evaporated within a single generation. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, every single American will feel the consequences directly. Everything we import, which includes almost everything we consume daily, will cost dramatically more in dollar terms. Interest rates on mortgages, automobile loans, and credit cards will spike upward. The federal government will face impossible choices between slashing popular services or raising taxes substantially or both simultaneously. The comfortable American middle-class lifestyle that we consider our birthright will become a historical memory rather than a current reality. This isn't fear-mongering or exaggeration. This is precisely what happened to Britain. This is exactly what happens when a debtor nation loses the confidence of its international creditors. The timeline concerns me more than anything else. Britain's transition from apparent strength to obvious weakness took approximately 30 years from 1920 to 1950. But the final collapse, when it finally arrived, took less than 2 weeks to complete. America's transition has been underway since at least the 1970s, when we abandoned the gold standard entirely. We have been running trade deficits every single year since 1975. We have been accumulating federal debt at an accelerating pace since the 2008 financial crisis. The foundation has been weakening for 50 years. Which means our collapse, when it comes, will likely be even more sudden and severe than Britain's experience. I cannot predict whether that collapse will occur specifically in 2026. Nobody can forecast the exact moment when international confidence breaks decisively. But I can state with certainty that every year passing without fundamental structural changes makes the eventual reckoning significantly worse. Every additional $1 trillion we add to the national debt, every manufacturing facility we relocate overseas, every month we spend more than we earn as a country brings us measurably closer to our own Suez moment. The question isn't whether America will face its historical reckoning. The question is whether we'll be prepared when that moment arrives, whether we will have built the economic resilience, the national savings, the real productive industrial capacity necessary to weather the coming storm, or whether we'll be like Britain in November 1956, watching helplessly as decades of financial denial catch up with us in a matter of days. What can you personally do to protect yourself and your family? First, understand clearly that the federal government isn't going to save you from this transition. British citizens who trusted their government to manage the imperial decline lost everything they had worked to build. The people who survived and even prospered were those who protected themselves independently, who diversified their assets internationally, who developed real marketable skills, and built substantial personal savings. Second, pay careful attention to the warning signs as they develop. When you see foreign central banks reducing their dollar reserve holdings, when you see major countries signing trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely, when you see interest payments on the national debt exceeding military spending budgets, understand that the clock is ticking faster toward our crisis point. Third, don't let normalcy bias blind you to what's actually happening. The most dangerous phrase in all of finance is, "This time is different." Every empire that collapsed believed it was uniquely different from all previous empires. Every reserve currency that fell was held by people who could not imagine a world without their monetary dominance. History doesn't care about our national beliefs or our sense of exceptionalism. History only cares about mathematical realities and economic fundamentals. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it definitely rhymes. And right now, the rhyme between Britain's situation then and America's situation now is almost perfect. Same unsustainable debt patterns, same military overreach around the globe, same national arrogance about our supposed invincibility, same blindness to obvious warning signs, same stubborn refusal to see what's directly in front of our faces. The British Empire's ultimate fatal mistake was believing it was too big and too important to fail. America is making that identical mistake right now. We are living in the echo of history, following the same footsteps that led Britain off an economic cliff. And most Americans are too comfortable in their daily routines to notice what is actually happening to our country's long-term prospects. The only remaining question is whether we'll wake up to reality in time to change course, or whether 2026 will become our 1956. This is just one piece of the bigger picture. Subscribe if you want to understand the full context and how to better protect yourself in uncertain times. And the video on screen takes this story one step further.